Thank you for joining us today. Our panel, Metrics That Matter, Establishing Career Value in Higher Education. It's a privilege to be moderating this discussion. I had the honor a few weeks back of being involved in a previous conversation with this group, and it went so well and it was such a stimulating conversation that we really want to continue in a very casual conversation format. So we want everyone here to join in so we can include you in this conversation and in the work moving forward. To that end, I'd like to invite you to weigh in on the comments and questions and ask questions throughout our session. As you see on the screen, you can ask your questions in the Q&A box in the right-hand side of your screen. You can also upvote questions too, and I encourage you to do that. We'll answer your questions during the presentation or save them for discussion at the end of the session. You can also interact with other attendees in this session in the stage chat. Stage chats will stay in the session only. General chats are for the conference-wide discussions. Take the opportunity to meet some of the other attendees, see who's asking questions, get to know each other. Now I'm honored to introduce our panelists. Joining us today are Andy Chen, VP for Innovation and Career Development, Wake Forest University. Andy oversees the nationally recognized Office of Personnel and Career Development for students and alumni. The Wake Forest Network, based in San Francisco, the WF Board of Trustees Innovation Committee, and other university-wide innovation initiatives and projects. Andy, thank you so much for joining us today. Also joining us is David Clayton, Senior Vice President, Strata Network. Dave is responsible for the Consumer Insights Research Team. His research explores higher education and the work experiences of Americans between 18 and 65. Dave, thank you so much for joining us. And finally, we're joined by Christina Francis, Executive Director, JFF Labs. With over 20 years of experience in corporate operations and entrepreneurial ventures, Christina now oversees advisory, acceleration, data, and investing initiatives that connect traditional systems with systems disruptors to enable equitable economic mobility at JFF Labs. And I'm Felice Noodleman. I'll be your moderator today. I'm with the American Association of State Colleges and Universities. So let's get started. And Dave, I'm going to ask you to jump in with the first question. How has the pandemic accelerated and shifted learners' views of and confidence in higher education?
Thanks, Felice. It's fascinating to watch this continue to unfold as we have data from 2 years ago and 18 months ago and 6 months, and just looking at data this morning where if you look at a net promoter score for alumni, 64%, right? So you take away those who don't agree, but 64% strongly or agree that they would recommend the education to someone like them. So very healthy and strong for those who have successfully completed a degree. The challenges we see are amongst those that have eroded over the course of the pandemic are those who have not yet successfully completed a post-secondary credential. And so that has fallen in half in terms of the levels of those who strongly agree education would be worth the cost for them, and those who believe that education would make them an attractive job candidate. Compared to the fall of 2019 to the fall of 2020, that dropped in half for aspiring adult learners. And even currently enrolled students into the fall, they were no more likely to strongly agree that their education would be worth the cost on average than those adults who hadn't yet completed a degree. So that's hard. Mostly what we see is the level of uncertainty about what the future holds, and people are looking for that through line from education as a means to the financial mobility, security, predictability that they're aspiring to. And so with the uncertainty that surrounds us in our lives, that's suppressing perceptions of the value of education across a number of important potential current audiences. Those who've had success in the past, they remain for it and strongly in favor and support it. But those emerging prospective and current students are struggling.
Yeah, it sounds like you're really making the case for how career services might fit into a broader discussion around the value and relevance of higher education. If we're looking at what is the return on investment for an individual that wants to pursue education, can you speak to that a little bit in terms of how does career services fit into that broader discussion?
Well, Andy and Christina and you yourself, Felice, know so well. You've been on the front lines of doing that. So I can tell you what learners and prospective students think. And the most powerful up and to the right thing that we can find in any of our surveys where people agree that their loans were worth it, they agree their education will be worth it, they agree it was high quality, any of those questions we ask about their subjective perceptions even when you control for race, ethnicity, first generation, loan amount, income amount, it's that connection between the education and the career. If they felt supported in connecting their education to the career, they felt the coursework was relevant, if they had applied learning, internship work that was related to what they were studying, all those things just totally change. Like, it's for people who feel like they had poor support at their college or university to connect with career, 17% of those individuals believe that their education will be worth the cost. For those who feel like they had excellent support, it's 83% agree it's worth the cost. And so you just see that magnitude of shift where we can help people connect the dots rather than just leaving it up to them. And I know Andy and Christina, you see that in the real world on the front lines, but that's certainly the context that's pervasive in the data.
Yeah, that definitely speaks to the need for the strong relationships between education and employers. And Christina, jump in here. So what is the missing link between higher education and employers, and how is JFF filling this gap right now?
Yeah, no, I love Dave's points. And I would just underscore that talent remains the greatest asset for employers. And to stay competitive, as Dave was talking about, I think companies and higher ed must help learners prepare for and get into viable pipelines, jobs, careers, however you want to language it. And we just have to prepare workers and learners for this rapidly changing labor environment. And so what's missing right now, one, I think there's a need for employers in higher ed to speak the same languages and to sit at the same table so that we can work through the problem and opportunities. I also think we're still at a moment of recovery that requires bold vision from both employers and higher ed. And what we're seeing, this means a willingness to make radical changes in policy and practices that are more inclusive, flexible, and non-traditional, right? As higher ed becomes more skills focused and the corporate world does as well. Through our work at JFF, we are helping companies make that transition. We're bridging the understanding between sectors so that supply and demand are more in sync. We recognize that employers are more proactive about developing their workforces and working with training providers and partnering with higher ed to shape new curricula that is required. So we're seeing a lot of companies really step up to meet the challenge of this moment. We started our Recover Stronger initiative about a year ago, or right after COVID, and we've seen employers in higher ed really help make that translation between where business is going and the needs are, and how learners are and can best prepare for the work that's ahead. And so what JFF is doing is tightening the link between learning, working, and advancement by recognizing the power that employers play in equipping their talent and employees and skills, and just keeping them ahead from a competitive perspective and helping them truly advance. We also help employers credential talent. And an example of that is the work that we're doing with actually McDonald's, where we're helping them figure out how to give their frontline market recognized employees stackable credentials. So that initiative is called Under the Archways. I'm really helping that employee gain real post-secondary credit and speeding them to their path to a degree and advancement.
Oh, thank you. Exciting programs. And you're also speaking to, both you and Dave spoke to this notion that we can't just return back to the way it used to be, right? We have to rethink the enterprise. We have to rethink what we're doing and make sure it aligns to the core values and needs of our regions and our society. Our institutions, in partnership with employers, build the economic and social capital of our region and of our country. So Andy, that really begs the question of how are institutions redesigning our career services to better measure the journey, to better align with the goals and outcomes for students, and what more can be done to leverage existing data? What else needs to be collected? How do we stay current and relevant and speak to the changing landscape?
Thanks, Felice, for that very big question. A lot of big questions in that, and also really happy to be on this panel with Dave and Christina. Just really fun to hear about how Strata does work, really analyzing sort of what's going on with education as a whole. It's really great work and great reports, and that Christina with employers, helping employers think this through is really positive for us. When I think about this idea of what do we measure, so we actually are finding, and what do we measure, and actually how's it being redesigned? I think something that happened today that has come out, which is very clear, is that there are a set of schools that have a lot of resources that are actually being able to really think through how do we maybe restaff and have new kinds of roles, maybe building data capabilities within your teams that actually can understand better how are students doing in terms of being career ready, as well as their outcomes. We also have a whole set of schools who have very little resources, who actually have to find ways to partner with others around campus. In particular, I think some schools are doing some really great work with institutional research, or potentially with the registrar's office, or with even the enrollment office, where they're actually as a team thinking about how to measure. So I'd like to actually extend the idea of redesigning career services to redesigning your institution's way that they measure data. I think that's important, actually, not just put it on career services, because there are a lot of schools that don't have large teams and have the ability to reform roles. Some of the things that also have happened is I think some external providers have really stepped forward to fill in a lot of these gaps. So example would be Handshake and what they do with the data they provide us. They actually have tons of reports that are all automated that we can use, that aren't about us having to create things from scratch. And so I think learning how to use those tools is really important. At our school, we actually combine that data with a lot of other data and integrate it into Microsoft Business Intelligence. And as a result, we can actually do a lot of data visualizations real time, looking at a lot of different segments of our student body at different points in time, as well as different programs. I know that my friend Amjad Ayobi down at Tulane has used Salesforce, and he has created some really great data tables on how to track his students and how they're doing, both in the academic as well as in the career area. And then also I want to mention just what is going on with the Career Leadership Collective and what Jeremy Padoni is doing with the National Alumni Career Mobility Survey. Like, that's another example where there are outside providers who can help us actually measure results that aren't about us having to do it ourselves. I think one other major redesign that schools are finding is that some are experimenting with this idea of how can we do asynchronous online career education that really ensures all students understand what comprehensive career readiness really is and how they use the resources and services that the school provides. Because once actually you have students doing things in the online world, you can actually measure it better than in the offline world. And I do know that is something that is brand new for a lot of us. It really got accelerated during COVID, but I do think that is something that schools should really look at. And I've mentioned actually in an earlier session that we're actually developing something with Kaplan called Kaplan Career Corps that's actually going to enable a lot of schools who can't do that themselves to be able to do it by purchasing it from a third party. In terms of leveraging existing data, I just want to say a couple things is that when we combine our data sources and analyze it, we can better understand our students and our employers, and also our alumni, as I mentioned earlier with the NACM survey. We can better ensure better engagement, readiness, and outcomes. Those are sort of the three things I think about what we're trying to get out of students is engagement, readiness, and outcomes. And then we can better allocate our resources and how we communicate to students, recognizing that students are all very different. There's lots of different pockets of students, and we have to actually really understand that very well. Like, we have to dig deeper to understand the experiences and the readiness of our historically less engaged and often marginalized students. We know who they are, right? They're the first gen students, students of color, international students, some liberal arts students, not all of them, and student athletes. And we all intuitively know that we need to figure out how to help them, but we don't have any data. And so we actually have to really have this data to know where's it working, where's it not working, how bad is it really? I mean, I can't say enough about the difference between the students who are engaged and the students who aren't engaged. It's dramatic, just the way that Dave described, not only how they feel about their schools, but their outcomes and their overall experience. And so I will say that, all this data that we have, I know that we've used, they include student data already that exists from the registrar, handshake data from their student activity, their student outcomes, their employer activity. We actually are able to ask our own coaches, what are their perceptions of student career readiness, and actually take a survey that gets recorded in their records so that we can tell what our coaches think how our students are doing. We ask actually our students to self-survey themselves around this. And then we also ask them about feedback. And one of the things that I think a lot of us have gotten used to is this idea of how to use NPS. And so can we use NPS to measure student feedback on their career experiences, not only just with our office and our office's programs, but the overall university? We also need to ask the same of our employers. But I do think at the highest level, we need to redefine what we're measuring. And I do think this is where we run into problems that historically, we get asked questions by leadership at a university about like, how are our students doing? And we give oftentimes activity metrics. We have a certain number of students who are seeing doing a career appointment, or they use their career office. But the reality is actually, it's more than just activity. It's actually what they know, which is career readiness, and what will they achieve, their internships and their outcomes. And so we actually really have to figure out, how do we measure those things that is different than, did they go to an appointment one time in their 4 years? That doesn't tell you anything other than activity. It's a little bit like asking a teacher, did your students go to class? It's an attendance metric. It does matter, but it's not the ultimate measure of how career ready students are. Nor does it really tell us to tell our leaders how our students are really doing, and can we do it while they're in school? Usually when it's outcomes, it ends up being after they're already done, so we can actually help them at that point. So I do think that's the biggest thing, is really determining what are the success metrics, defining them well. At our school, actually, we've taken over 2 years to actually just figure out what the definitions are while we're measuring, so that we can actually be more clear about it and know how to communicate that up to our leadership group. So it's a challenging problem, but it is definitely one that I think schools are really intent on trying to solve. And I really appreciate how Handshake is trying to come up with a lot of easy ways for schools that have less resources to be able to have the metrics they need to at least understand who are those students who are engaged, who are not, and how do we especially help the students who are historically unengaged and oftentimes marginalized in the process.
Yeah, I think Handshake's definitely making it easier for us to get our heads around this and to engage with students. How are the students responding? And Andy, I'm going to ask you to jump in, and also if we can get Dave to sort of think forward. You have a lot of research that you're able to share with us. If we can really affect this change and really improve and change the way we think about career planning and career services as not an episodic activity, but as something that is really laddered through a student's career. So Andy, start us off. How are students responding? Dave, jump in with sort of thinking ahead a little bit of what you'd hope to see in the next data that you collect. And Christina, talk a little bit about what this will mean to the employers.
It's interesting. I actually think when it comes to students, sort of the data that we might use to understand them, for the most part, what the students actually are interested in, what I actually think is going to happen through the use of Handshake, but also through our own knowledge, is actually we're going to be able to educate the students better on what are the things that you need to do to actually have a good experience, to get a good internship and a good job. If students have that data, they'll actually be more motivated to behave in certain ways because they have seen, oh, this is what proves to work. Right now, we actually don't have a ton of data about that. And so what happens is that we tell them stories and we give them examples. And in their heads, they're thinking, that sounds like a great example, but I can think of 100 reasons why I'm not like that person. There's a different person than that, and that wasn't me. And so I'm not sure I need to or I should follow that. But I do think that having data that gives students some understanding as to, for example, what are my real odds of actually getting a job if I apply to Google, given my background? If I knew that it was 1 in 10 million, I'd apply to more other places. But if I don't know, I'll just apply to Google and I'll get that job. And when I'll get upset that they didn't actually reply back to me. That seems so basic, but we don't do that. We don't actually give people that much information. The other thing is that I do think that for our own offices to actually really understand, as I said before, the difference between those students who are not engaged and who they are. And again, our intuition is that they're the students who've actually coming in with challenges already for lots of different reasons. Why wouldn't we over rotate to try to really help those students? I just really think that that's one of those things that we all do this, sort of out of the goodness of our heart. It's a little bit like diversity is good because it's right. It's actually, there's data that shows that it's really making a difference if we actually don't actually invest in the right places. So I do think that that's actually really helpful. We use our data in one other way, which is it's not only for our own offices. It was talked about in an earlier session about like how do schools develop better partnerships with employers? If you have data about your students and which companies are seeing and which ones they aren't, and what those companies that they're seeing and what they're doing, and can actually show companies like these are the kinds of things you need to do to actually really recruit our students, they're going to believe you because there's data. And so we actually have dashboards for all of our employers that we will share with them as to here's your history of recruiting at our school. Here's how it compares to the other people in your industry sector. Here's actually, where you rank relative to them. We don't give them actually who the other companies are, but they're just astounded. So in fact, we become a consultative sort of relationship manager with our employers that also helps us build relationships with our employers. So we're just really excited now that we're actually starting to really talk about data. And I think what's also a really interesting challenge is that we actually have to educate our leaders as to the right way to think about this information. They actually don't know anything about like what we do. And so waiting for them to ask us for this information isn't going to actually work well. So I would say, don't wait to be asked for it. You need to define what needs to be measured and why. And no one on your campus knows more about this than you. It's a real opportunity for you to be not only educator to your students and employers, but also to the leaders at your school.
And as a former chancellor, I could not agree more. It is so important to keep surfacing that information because that information is what helps drive strategic decision making. Dave and Christina, jump in here in terms of your thoughts of this evolution and change, thanks to things like Handshake and others, of how we're reframing and rethinking career services.
Christina?
Yeah, I was actually going to make two points, both some points that Andy mentioned, just around first the use of data. I think it's really interesting now with data visualization to actually be ahead and looking at how people are actually paying for education and training and where employers can help create employee benefits for paying for education or additional learning, and looking at new financing models around emerging accessibility and opportunity. The other area, and I think to your question around for me, is the way that corporations are recruiting. And so the talent acquisition process that companies have relied on for decades has changed completely. And so we're looking less in-person interviews, less corporate site visits. And so really finding innovative ways, corporations finding innovative ways to assess competency and fit for the virtual environment, and how they're using online tools to support job seekers as they're finding the jobs, right? And then also onboarding is another area, and then integrating into that culture. Another point that Andy mentioned just around the pipeline. So the traditional pipelines for talent has also been heavily disrupted. So we're looking at how can we increase corporate leadership commitments to diversity and inclusion and skill-based hiring and advancement. And then again, on that pay, how are people actually paying for college? So those are areas that we're seeing a lot around the corporations.
It's really a fascinating, and Felice, your experience as chancellor, and Andy, you've had a unique role at being elevated to the cabinet level, right? And it's the commitment at your institution to pioneer some of those things where it's access, and Christina, as you point out. For me, that is, we want education to be more connected to work, and employment and fulfilling and meaningful work. And so how do we make that, take it out of the silos on our own campuses as well? And I think sometimes even showing faculty, look, these are the students who took your course in the last 20 years, and look, these are the careers they have, and these are the places they work and the things they do. And sometimes just that level of awareness, they're so immersed in the academy, they're not aware. The other thing we've really seen is that ability to, we sometimes assume for something we hold near and dear that people will connect dots the same way we do. So if we, in our curriculum as a faculty person, design a team project or this or that, or verbal in-person presentations and dress up and present, we think we know why that matters. But It doesn't mean that those students know why. And so that intentionality and helping them do reflections on what are you learning, why are you learning this, how will you use this, and some of that meta discourse can really go a long way for the good intentions that are already there. So that's low-hanging fruit, but showing in faculty and creating a culture on campus to do that. The thing that we see is most predictive of that subjective rating of alumni, that it was worth the cost and it's benefited my life, is their career satisfaction. And their career satisfaction is driven by three things, so nobody's left out. Quality of classes and professors, right? The quality of the support services, and these career connections to career, the advising, the internships, the placement, the alumni network. But those career connection to career elements are the least utilized and accessed and the most variable in their quality and their experience. So really think about that three-legged stool. What I would love to see is that integration, just as we think about support services, high quality academics, weaving in more intentionally throughout the experience, that connection to career, whether it's the meta discourse or it's the design of experiences and connections. I think that's the power for change. And that's there are a third of students and alumni who, if they just come to class and learn new things, they have the social capital, they have the opportunities, they have the life trajectories that the current system works great for them. But for that bottom half and bottom two-thirds, this is the instrumentality to the social mobility and economic mobility and stability that they need. That's what they need and what they're seeking. There's a young woman who shared in a survey we just got back, her quote of how she's feeling. She graduated from high school class of 2020, planned to go on to college, got an acceptance letter, chose not to go because of COVID. Why? She said, I'm overwhelmed. I don't want to take on debt for something that's not going to be productive. I don't have any help from anybody in my family to do this, and I don't know what to do. So but I feel stuck because I know additional education is essential for a livable wage and lifestyle. So this is a young woman, 19 years old, living in West Virginia, working full time, accepted to college, chose not to go because she's unsure about the path forward and how to do it. And those are the people that if we can signal, not just, she believes in the promise of education. You need it to have a livable wage, meaningful work, right? But, and she's a hard worker. She's working full time coming out of high school, but she doesn't have confidence in the plan of what does that mean here for me and the jobs that I can get and live where I want to live, what I want to do. And so that's the real service we can provide, I think, to this generation coming forward. And we have a moment, honestly, if we think of the GI Bill and the crisis, right, and the focus on access, with the federal funding, with the disruption, with the technology, with the data systems, the tools, the innovators that are coming in around, we have a moment here over the next 5 years to really change the trajectory of higher ed and lead, and others will follow, in the following decade. But I see this as a real opportunity. These opportunities don't come very often. Tragedy, certainly, but what do we do with that tragedy, and how do we take the best of the past and build to the future with the new opportunities? Just compelling, the work Christina and Felice and Andy and all of you who are here today focusing on this. I think many on your campuses don't perhaps recognize the instrumentality of where you are and what that means about the next generation of people who believe in the promise of education, if we can meet this generation where they are.
I know I'd ask you, our 300 institutions that have also the majority of Pell students are really educating for the new American demographic. And that's going to form the economic and social capital of this country. So this conversation is incredibly important and incredibly timely. But Andy, you touched on this, David, you touched on this, and Christina. If we don't position this moment as a moment to really help students understand that education leads to a dynamic workforce and career, right? That there really is a path there. Career services has to be in the conversation. Andy, as Dave mentioned, you're in the cabinet level. So talk a little bit about the role of career services to really help our institutions more broadly meet our missions and objectives. And how can career service offices demonstrate that they can and should be a part of this strategic conversation?
Thanks, Felice. One of the things that I think I've come to learn in the role that I've got an opportunity to play, being at the cabinet level and working with a lot of other vice presidents, is I have insight to the conversations and just connections to people that are talking about the school at a level that I was unaware of. So I have to admit, like I just that would make. I know part of it is the feeling of having access to have some influence to get things done, but there was also the topics. And so what I found is I listened really closely to our president and my colleagues. And the one phrase we use at Wake Forest is whole person education. And so one of the things I think a lot about is most schools say something like that. And I try to think about, well, how can I connect what we do as part of whole person education without telling them to drop whole person education? So I'm not trying to tell them their words are wrong. You got to use my words. It's actually, how do we actually make the idea of being career ready? Someone wrote in the chat something about teaching students how to fish, how to give them the tools to be employable for life, to be citizens that are contributing and leaders. Well, one of the ways is actually they actually understand what it means to be career ready. When you look at the competencies that are required for career readiness, of which obviously NACEs are very focused on holistic career readiness, I found that the career office can control those things that are really about, honestly, how do you be strategic about getting a job? And how do you think about that so that for your whole life, you can actually know how to go about that process without having to say, I need on-campus recruiting to get me a job. Or I got to figure it out myself, that actually you learn some things while you're in school. So I think that's one dynamic where we're part of the mission of most schools, not all. Second is that we all talk about ROI in some sense, although we actually interestingly don't talk about it from the standpoint of like putting numbers and trying to calculate what it was your actual financial ROI. But the way that it really comes out that most of our, I think, parents and students want to hear it is, so what are the outcomes for all of your students? How did it turn out? Like, are they getting jobs? What kinds of jobs? And how do the student alumni who went to your school feel about the payback of the school experience that they had? So I do think that is something that, to the extent that we can gather that data and present it to our leadership, they can actually start to realize either one, we're doing a great job, we should talk more about it, or two, this isn't as good as it should be, we should try to do something different. And that hopefully people will say, this is just part of what we should do, and realize, oh, the career office can help me with this, as you said, Felice, as opposed to, I need to go ask the career office for this because I know what I want. I think sometimes they don't really know exactly what they want. Here's another big one, which we all know. And I know there's some schools who have said, well, enrollment's great at my school, and so that's not a problem. But I will tell you that for like 95 or 98% of the schools in the country, enrollment is a problem. You're either getting not enough students who can pay, or you're actually just not getting enough students because there's too many choices. And oh, by the way, the old demographics of the whole world is declining in terms of students going to traditional college. So how do we actually address their number one concern for the people who might be deciding to make a choice? And that is, honestly, from all surveys, it is, will I get a good job if I attend this school? And if we don't actually talk about it, they still may come to your school, but the whole time they're wondering, well, why do you talk about that? Like, does it mean you don't care? We just assume it'll happen? I just think that is another example that we have to do our best to show we have the data to show what the outcomes are. And actually, even if they're not good, it's good to tell people so that you can say, the whole school has to help us make these better so we can actually tell the students who want to come here that we help them get jobs. I think hopefully the best presidents out there will say, we're going to give you a great education, you're going to be an amazing critical thinker, and you will get a great job. And we care about you for the rest of your career. I do think that that's sort of a message that most people are waiting to hear. Another thing people really care about is retention, right? They really care about the fact that we have found that students will tell us, if I actually go through a organized career course process, it can be for credit, it doesn't have to be, it can actually be something that is a policy requirement, like You can't do on-campus recruiting unless you actually do this. You can't get access to the alumni directory if you don't do this. Like, there are ways that you can do it without it being about for credit. But the thing is, when they do it, they say, I'm clear about my academic direction and my career direction. I have more self-confidence, and I actually feel like I belong to this school because you helped me to network, to build social capital. That is the thing. Everyone can do that on their own, but most students hate to network, and so they need some help with that. We can help them with that if we do it. And finally, we really care about having alumni goodwill. Why? Because that helps us to get more students, but also it helps us raise money. And so if the alumni feel good about the process that we use to help them, just like the way that Dave said earlier, that the difference between the people who actually graduated, who felt their school helped them into their career, is dramatically different than those who don't. So I think it is fundamentally important for all institutions to value what career services does. And I do think it's an interesting challenge trying to figure out, how do you make sure you're working in an institution where the leaders around you all actually want the same thing? And you have to spend some time. And that is one of the jobs that's, I think, hardest about a career services director job now, is that you are part like manager of an operation, and you may be a light career coach, but really you aren't supposed to be a career coach, because you're actually supposed to be building bridges all across the institution, trying to get everyone on board to help students. So you're actually more of a sort of networker, bridge builder, relationship manager, joint venture kind of person than you are a career counselor. And so I do think that that's an important thing, that if you are in the leadership role, to sort of rethink how you think about who you are, because you are really a representative of the school, both internally and externally.
So we've been mixing this sort of internal perspective, external perspective from the employers, from those helping students find the path and build those relationships. So we've got this mix of internal, external. So I'll ask this question, then I want to dive a bit more into the metrics and how we really understand engagement. So what is the future of higher ed from your perspectives, both the internal perspective and the external? Christina, we'll start with you on, if you're thinking about this as a moment in time and we can build the future for higher ed, and it's going to include strong relationships with employers, what does that look like? What does this future look like?
Yeah, I'll give a few thoughts on that. And one point that Andy mentioned is this whole person education. I really do think the future is around treating learning as a personalized experience that meets the learner both where they are and then also where the employers need the worker, the learner, to be. We've got to get strategic about jobs, about options that students and learners have, whether they're seeking jobs or careers or entrepreneurship as a career. Those are things that we need to bring into the fold on the conversation. I think the other thing that I want to just go back to that Dave mentioned around the story that he shared of the young lady who decided not to go to college, and the importance of first generation students without resources or people around them that have lived experience in college. Andy talked about return on investment. I think one of the other things we need to think about is return on relationship, right? And how are colleges, universities, these alumni networks really helping to provide a full engagement to their communities and students? So how are students finding jobs through alumni? How are students obtaining work-based learning through their alumni network? How are students learning about jobs or careers? And how are students navigating that college work? We talk a lot about wraparound services. Some of it might be mental health support, and not necessarily class selection. And so really figuring out all of the wraparound services needed. And I think it's an all hands on deck opportunity right now to be successful.
Thank you. Dave, and then Andy, future of higher ed and this link with workforce.
Yeah. Two different conversations last week where one of the major employers who's taken the initiative to offer their own credentials is actually coming back to two different organizations to help them translate those credentials into degrees awarded and credentials awarded by the academy. And, with a 10% completion rate, they're saying, well, one is maybe everybody doesn't want to spend their life with this industry credential. And two, they're saying the completion's got to be better than this. And with the faculty and with academic, with the support systems, people can be more successful. So I think we'll see this. We're in this interim transition period where Employers are going to lead out and try and do it on themselves, and they're going to come back to the academy, and the leading academy leaders in the academy will be, the bleeding edge or the cutting edge, but they'll meet them there and it'll come back. But I think ultimately we're going to see more of that hybrid partnership between short-term credentials that stack, that you get something of value that helps you in the short term on your way to the longer term degree. And that perpetuates a culture of lifelong learning, and I can go back and learn. And so that's in the best interest of traditional higher education, to have that ongoing pipeline and relationship. And then just to Christina and Andy's point, there were two schools that we run an annual alumni survey that we offer to schools to participate in. And two of the schools that did that in 2019, they actually saw that their alumni, we didn't ask about donating, but alumni who were interested and willing to engage in job shadowing and mentoring and career talks on campus. And that's how they wanted to be engaged. Different programs at the two universities, but they came back and created settings where, in one case, the Promise Scholars, first generation, low income, last dollar full tuition scholarships for these 150 students from across the state. Each of them was mapped with a one-on-one alumni mentor from that group of alumni who wanted to give back. They weren't buying season tickets or naming a building after themselves, but they wanted to give. And so that blend, and at the same time, the faculty see, oh, these are my alumni helping my current students. And so it elevates that. Somebody talked about Andy's out there kissing babies and passing out cigars, I guess, in Wake Forest. But that notion of brokering and making visible those connections, I think will increase the currency of time and engagement beyond financial currency. And we have the platforms and the technology. We're all meeting virtually, right? It's the burden of doing that is decreased, but we can still create the personal connections. And then big data, I think our data systems just don't allow us to track people through time and through transfer and through lifelong learning. And how do you, to Christine's point around personalized learning, how do you give somebody ownership of that and be able to travel with you and be mobile, and then let us better serve individuals and understand the lived experience and the applied pieces. We're seeing those forces in other sectors of our world and our economy, and it's coming. And if we can be on the front of that, we can really lead and help others. Andy spent a lot of time talking about even not big data, but controlled integrated data, right? And systems that Handshake and Microsoft and the things he's doing.
One of the things that comes to mind that Felicia, you're asking about the future. So I think a lot of people heard I did this TEDx talk, 2013, career services must die. And so I got asked by the leaders at the ASU GSV conference. So that's Arizona State and Global Silicon Valley Venture Firm. So those two, they do this annual conference in San Diego each year, and they asked me to do a reprise. So I asked them what I should call it, and they called it Career Services Must Die Part 2. And it's actually available on YouTube, and it's actually designed to ask, so now in 2020, it was actually done in the fall of 2020, what happened this last 7 years, and what's going to happen in the next 7. And what happened in the last 7 actually was a lot to what Christine talked about early on in one of the conversations. I think it was the one with Paul, about the fact that even though we have seen some change, and we've seen some leadership change, and we've seen some intentional investment, it ends up being at a lot of schools that are very well resourced. So, if you take 5,000 universities in the United States, 500, you see some improvement, but 4,500, you don't see a whole lot. They still only have 1, 2, or 3 people running a career office for, honestly, I heard someone say there's a 3-person career office for 10,000 students. That just doesn't sound right. Like that doesn't sound like that's not the right thing when you say one of the things you're actually trying to do is have people have professional and social mobility to change the direction of your life. There's 3 people that work with all the employers to hire 10,000 students a year. Like that honestly, I just was really saddened to hear that. So to me, I sort of find myself thinking schools that will have to really make a decision. Are we really going to change? Are we really going to do this right? Of which we may actually have to make some decisions around adjusting the way we budget, or the way we're organized, or the way that this all happens. And so I just am really, honestly, really proud when I meet a university president who says, you know what, I'm trying to understand this problem. I actually want to know who are the 5 or 6 people in the university I need to bring into the room, which usually is the head of career services, the head of advancement, one of the academic leaders like the provost or the dean, the head of admissions, maybe the head of communications. And you say to them, I want us to be better. I want to meet once a month and hear what you all are doing to actually help me tell this story in the way that I want us to tell it. And I don't want to know how you do it. You guys will figure it out. But please help this career services director, who is not a VP, make this something that our whole institution gets committed to. Those are the schools that I think you will start to see that is a positive future. And I do think that the other side of it is that, as as Christina is saying, is that there are companies who actually are starting to realize we can start to figure out how to do this on our own. We can actually take students who are adults who didn't go to college. We can take students who actually decided not to go to college, bring them into our offices, into jobs, and tell them you can get a degree online, and we'll pay for your way, so you can actually make money while you're actually getting your degree. So there are going to be schools out there right now who are like already hurting from an enrollment standpoint, you're going to be hurting even more. And that there are going to be a few schools like Arizona State, or maybe one of the Ivy League schools decides to get really innovative and partners with some of these companies to go into business to offer degrees with the companies. And I do think that's actually going to happen. And so I think for the student, it's actually going to get better. It's going to become more choice, more options, more price levels. It's not going to be about just prestige and everyone has to go to Harvard or some Ivy League school. And I think that's going to be better. But it's going to be confusing for a while because a lot of people are going to wonder, is this going to pay out? Because if it doesn't, should I have done something else? But I actually believe that in the long term, as the sort of we get through the bubbles here, it's going to end up working out. But every school is going to have to figure out, what do I uniquely, distinctly offer that makes our school great? Of which one of those things has to be, and we help you get a job, and we help you think about like how to be career ready. Because if we don't offer that at all, people are going to find it in other kinds of ways. So part of me, sort of just like the way Christine kicked off the conference, is that change is going to come. It's in the water, and it is like, we just have to be ready, and we have to just be part of it, knowing that honestly, everyone who's in the career world, like we're all worried about like, will like robots replace this? I actually think no, because actually people are more and more like worried about trying to understand this whole landscape of how to go from like high school to career, that if you're in it and you're learning and you're actually finding your ways to develop your skills, there are going to be all types of avenues on how you might be able to work that may not be actually what you're doing right now. And that's okay. Like, I think that's the thing, is that we're not secure because we're in higher ed, that we can't do what people who are actually, doing data science or marketing in a for-profit company. It's like the world is getting, like, all the walls are breaking. And yes, it feels really scary, but it's actually honestly super exciting because we're actually having conversations. We can talk to each other like this. In the old days, we couldn't talk to each other. Like, we're in our own little holes, like not knowing what's going on. So I think we're all in it together. And that's actually both, a little scary, but really exciting.
So speaking of talking with each other, we have a lot of questions from attendees, and they're asking about metrics. So let's dive in. I also want to see us link any conversation about what are the most important metrics for measuring success, and how do we really think about this in terms of social mobility and equity. So we're getting some questions in terms of, how are you tracking employer recruiting outcomes? How are you tying this work to student learning outcomes? What are the most important metrics that you are tracking, that you're collecting, and are you seeing any impact in terms of social mobility and equity, closing equity gaps?
I'll start with mine, given what we've done. And I made a presentation actually to Handshake a while ago, and trying to figure out how we might socialize this in a bigger way. So we'll figure that out. I'd say, and it's been interesting, like I said, it's taken us multiple years to get to a place where at the highest level, what everyone knows, that there is one, outcomes. Like, what are students actually getting? That's what students want to do, is they want to know, what am I going to get? So internships, jobs, that's actually, and/or grad school or other types of options. But that's sort of the one piece that we're trying to measure. There's a second piece of that, which is, I think some people would like to know, okay, given what you're getting, like, how desirable is this for you? So that's sort of like a custom question you like to know. Is this something that you're happy with? So there's one, getting something, then there's something that you're happy with getting. So that's the second level. And then there's, I think, another area. So that's outcomes. The second piece is related to, I'll use the word satisfaction just for the sake of the idea of it, but it's not necessarily fully satisfaction. But we've talked about NPS. So there's NPS as it relates to the student experience overall, in terms of their overall experience at college, as it relates to their career readiness. And so I think that's one. And the second is actually their overall experience with the programs, resources, and events that the school offered as it relates to it. And the reason why I don't say the career services office, because a lot of people actually asked this before, they said half this time the students actually don't even know that the career service office put together that whole program that the student actually got. I can't tell you the number of times I've gone on a career trek that we totally organized, and later the student tells me that they actually got a job on that career trek, and I said, oh, like, how do you think about the career office? They said, I hate the career office. They don't do anything. I got that job all by myself because I went on that trek. It's like, but we put on the trek, you know? So I do think we have to be careful. Like, we don't accidentally ask a question that already like handicaps our office. It's actually not about the office, it's about everything we do. So I do think that that's sort of second level. So outcome, satisfaction. Now the big one that actually we're really focused on is readiness. So is there a way we can actually measure how ready students are, which is very related to what the academics are trying to do when it comes to competencies. So again, the most innovative schools in the country are actually looking at competencies and skills. What are you learning? So like use Southern New Hampshire as an example. We're not going to measure based on did you do the hours? That's a little bit more like attendance and did you go to see the advisor? It's actually, did you learn what you were supposed to learn? And if you did, check. So the question we have is, so are students actually career ready? And we actually are trying to figure out like what are the ways that we're going to measure that subjective, you know, our call and employers call, the students self measure. We actually trying to figure out the right kind of survey mechanism to get that. So those would be the three big pieces, I'd say: readiness, outcomes, satisfaction. But the one in the very front that we also are using as a metric is just engagement. So we're actually trying to understand the level of engagement and the difference between highly engaged, low engaged, and not engaged. Like the difference between like low and not engaged. We need to know who those students are because they're going to have challenges. And so we actually have a lot of data to be able to measure that. We're just trying to figure out like how to factor those different items to figure out what the engagement level is. So of which engagement might include things like, are you applying to jobs? Are you going to events? Are you going to any of the career coaching or workshop sessions and things like that? Are you going to a career course? These are all great activity metrics, but as you know, you could actually go to all those things and still be really horrible. Like you might not learn anything. You might have actually just walked in the door and showed up, checked in, and didn't do a thing. I can't count that as you're really ready to go because you walked in the door and checked in. And so there's a lot of gray in that that's hard to measure, which we have to, that's where we used to be, which is we had all this activity. If they just do more activity and we get more students to do this stuff, it'll be better. But actually that doesn't really make sense, right? From the standpoint of we don't want them to do a lot of things. We want them to do the few most important things that matter to them that are going to have the highest amount of leverage, that hopefully will be the least amount of effort and cost for us to do. Because if we actually all we're trying to do is do more and more and more, the answer is we got to hire more and more counselors. And until we have 100 counselors, then we'll be okay. But that we know is fundamentally not going to happen. So we actually have to think in other kinds of ways. So those are the key things we're looking at. We actually have a pretty good dashboard of which we're always refining it and always battling over like, what do we put in? What do we take out? Because you can imagine our data team hates that I come away from like conferences like this and they say, okay, I want to change something else. So they're probably on the line right now, just pulling their hair out. So anyways.
So you know we're going to get questions for people to see your dashboard. Christina, jump in. The metrics that are most important in terms of the work with employers.
I think Andy mentioned a lot, but a couple of things that we're measuring with our employers now, it's, you know, how employers are auditing their hiring processes. So are they taking out unnecessary filters, for example? We're looking at how employers are finding new talent pipelines. You know, how can you expand beyond the traditional channels to source non-traditional candidates? We're also measuring how our employees are learning from each other, how they're learning from their peers with communities like our corporate action platform, for example. But a few things that Andy mentioned, and I want to go back to the data piece earlier, is that we're also amplifying worker and learner stories to better share data around advancement and differentiated pathways. and advancement for people, particularly advancement for people of color, Black workers and learners. One, to better get the stories out there, but also to elevate the data and elevate the opportunities that exist. We also think it's important to assess not only the impact of traditional post-secondary credentials, but also the impact of industry-based credentials as more institutions and employers are embedding those into jobs in different degrees. So those are other areas to add on top of Andy.
Dave, any thoughts? Metrics, the most important metrics that we need to
We all have our level, and we try to braid these things together. For us, we're looking at, right, Kim Wilcox, Chancellor at UC Riverside, we were talking with him. He was briefing our team at Strata about change and said, 10 years ago, nobody asked me about completion rates, right? 10, 12 years ago. Now everybody wants to know about completion rates. Well, what about beyond completion? And Andy and Christine both spoke to outcomes. So how do we measure the things that are happening right now? How do we see those ultimate outcomes? And so we're really trying to provide with the field with insights into three key questions, right? Beyond completion is essential, right? But then if you look at, do you have a good job, one that pays 40,000 a year, say you're the national average, is above the median wage of somebody who is attended high school only is 30,000. And then do they believe it was worth the cost? And do they believe their education helped them achieve their goals? And so when you take those, and you asked Felice about closing equity gaps, when you take those three, 40,000 a year, achieve my goals, worth the cost, you get 75 to 80% of the alumni who graduated in the last 20 years saying, yes, I agree. But when you ask how many can say agree to all three of those, it drops down to 52%. And if you look at the gender difference, females are 25% less likely than males to say yes to all three. Students of color are 12% less likely. First generation students are 18% less likely. So you start to kind of that compounding interest of how are we serving these individuals and are we delivering on the promise? Hopefully that gives leaders a lens for culture change and systems change in their communities and campuses, and policymakers and funders and advocates, something to be in the service of. And so that's how we're trying to help the field address and close those equity gaps, is looking at those outcomes through the experience of the learners and the students, not just the administrative, descriptive, do you have a job, those types of things. Thank you, Andy and Christina, and Felice as well. I think you're wrapping up, but and thank you to all in the chat. I've been taking notes of the ideas and the things you're sharing, and just a vibrant community today, so thank you.
There was no way we could get to all the questions. We tried to build in as much, but there's a lot here in terms of how to make the case for career services and how to really elevate that in the eyes of leadership. I think this type of conversation and the ability to really think deeply about the student experience, about the pathway you're building for students, about this connection between career services, workforce, about the relationships that are developed with students, the level of engagement, the level of intentionality that Andy has brought to this work, the level of thinking that Christina has brought to this work, and Dave, just your overall sense of where this landscape is going, and really how to focus on some of the most important attributes and areas for both higher ed and employers. This has been an exceptional conversation, and I thank everyone who submitted questions. I hope we got to as many of them as you needed to be addressed, and there will be more conversation to come. Thank you all so very much, Andy, Dave, and Christina. Thank you.